than in the community. With deviant peers, interestingly, youth who have deviant peer influences, they're more likely to be engaging in violence in the community generally. So we see deviant peer influences not a really strong predictor of, or differentiator, between, whether you're going to engage in weapons-based violence in particular or gun violence at school. Youth with deviant peers consistently are just more likely to be engaging in violence if they do so in the community. In terms of parental control, so this is kind of this dark one is if they really obey their parents. And we see for youth who obey their parents a lot, so they have kind of rules that they follow, they're more likely to be engaging in violence at school, not in the community, probably where their parents can't see what they're doing, right? If they're obeying their rules. Now for some of the kind of adverse childhood experiences and kind of family home factors, we see that youth who have experienced things like family member incarceration, they're actually more likely to be engaging in community violence. And same with maltreatment. So in the models I had abuse, kind of neglect, and sexual abuse separately. I kind of combined them here just for the sake of presentation to look at if there was any maltreatment in the home. And so we see that youth who are, had maltreatment are actually more likely to be engaging in violence in the community and less so at school. And very similar patterns with exposure to family violence. So these kinds of traditional kind of risk factors for violence seem to, again, apply more to violence in the community. So given all of these kinds of patterns, like what does this mean? Well, preliminarily, we see that there's some differences in who's most likely to commit crime or violence at school versus in the community. We see race differences here, where white youth are actually more likely to be arrested for violence at school than in the community when it's serious forms of violence. Males, if they do commit violence with a weapon or a gun, they're more likely to do so outside of their school. Youth with internalizing symptoms, if they commit serious violence like with a weapon or a gun, they're actually more likely to do so at school. And then things like deviant peer, parent, household risk factors are more strongly associated with community violence than school violence. But then across the board, there was also null findings, which means that there were no differences between the likelihood of violence at school versus in the community. So youth who commit crime or violence at school also tend to just have less extensive criminal histories, and gang-involved youth are just as likely to commit crimes at school as in the community. So we didn't see gang being a significant predictor in a lot of the models, but that's simply because there's no differences in their likelihood of violence at school versus the community. Okay. So this also tells us there's some meaningful differences that we should consider, at least given these preliminary findings between school violence and community violence. And so some of our more traditional kind of criminological predictors are more associated with community violence than school violence. And so we want to be careful if these things are being considered in any type of threat assessment or risk assessment instruments, that we're not treating youth with these kind of hardships at home, in particular with being at risk or dangerous in the school environment, which can have negative consequences for them. Depressed or anxious youth are more likely to carry out serious violence at school. This tells us that these youth are probably vulnerable and in need of support and intervention or attention, right, in the school setting. But then also there's some factors that really just cut across multiple contexts that we need to be considering as risk factors like gang involvement. So we can say in some ways that the school context is likely unique, and what these data so far, because these are official records, what they don't capture right now are things like peer social hierarchies or in-group, kind of out-group social dynamics that we also know matter. So we're hoping to get more of that kind of context and enrichment from some of the qualitative work that we're doing. But I think it's still important, even though we see these differences, that schools really still shouldn't be viewed fully independent of community context. We need to be aware of violence and altercations in the community that can also spill into the school setting, which is a real issue. So as part of this project, I've started doing some qualitative interviews with school personnel, and I have one quote from a principal, I think that really speaks to this. This is someone who's in the South region of Florida, in a school where there's violence and that occurs in the community. So this principal told me, I need to keep my ear to the streets, and I work hard to do that. Because our SRO, School Resource Officer, might not know if something goes down outside of this jurisdiction, which is the school grounds. How it works, if things don't go down at school, it's not their business. But I need to know from my standpoint if there's a violent altercation, if there's a shooting, or there's a stabbing in the neighborhood, because that's going to affect our kids and their behaviors, their interactions during the school day. But the SROs, they maybe don't know about violence that doesn't happen right here. There's not a lot of communication in that sense with law enforcement or others in the community to share information on incidences in the neighborhood that affect our kids. From my standpoint, that's a big issue. So again, although we see a unique youth maybe engaging in violence in different contexts, it's important that we see, again, that what goes on in the community really affects life at school. Okay, now in terms of policy implications, I always have to question practices and policies that serve to make school settings more hostile, less inclusive, and more punitive. You mean with the findings from the meta-analysis where we were kind of showcasing social competence and these peer dynamics, the state of Florida said, well, maybe we can add that to our threat assessment. Like, well, maybe we should think about it in a different way, as like maybe we should try and support these kids rather than use these as kind of risk factors to monitor, control, and further exclude youth from the school setting, especially youth of color. And so it's really important that we use this information in a way that can be helpful to enrich school environments, to probably increase school belonging and support, improve school climate and culture. And two, given that, we do see different kind of youth perhaps engaging in community violence versus violence at school, we need to know as well what goes on outside of schools to better enrich youth's lives while they're there. So it's important to kind of involve family and community members in discussions of what goes on at school and what goes on in the community or at home. So again, this is very preliminary. So the next steps in this project, given that I focus purely on kind of like the individual and family factors today, there's also community and contextual predictors that we're going to look at. There's school level analyses that we can do, so not just looking at whether youth who engage in violence are different, but how schools themselves where violence occurs are different from other schools that have less violence. We're also looking, because we have such lengthy spans of data, and Florida has done a lot, positive and negative, to kind of address the problem of school violence. We're going to see how some of those policy changes over time, especially the proliferation of school resource officers in schools, has affected levels of school violence. In linking these youth arrest records to adult arrest records, we can see if youth who are, engaging in violence at school even go on in the life course to be have continued involvement in the criminal justice system or not, and also how they're treated in terms of their punishment for violence that occurs at school. And then, of course, the qualitative interviews I'm doing hopefully can help fill in a lot of the missing gaps and limitations with official measures and provide some more further insights. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you. Questions?
Do you want to handle the questions, or do you want to handle the questions?
I can handle the questions. Okay, so thank you so much, Jillian. This is fantastic. Questions? I can start us off while you're thinking. I do have a question based on the school resource officer.
Yeah.
So we just evaluated the SRO programs here in Edmonton and for the Edmonton Public School Board, is that how it's called, and the Edmonton Catholic School District. And it seems that the SROs in these two boards, the program seems to be focused on relationship building with the youth and doesn't necessarily have an enforcement angle to that. This sounds quite different, is that correct? So there's no relationship building between the SOs and the students?
I think there's variation by districts for sure. So in Florida, SROs go through their own kind of academy for training, and it is very much built on trust with students, like improving rapport, having someone that you can speak to and talk to. But in practice, we see, and again, there's variation, but some of the school resource officers take a far more punitive kind of law enforcement role in, cracking down on weapons, cracking down on contraband in schools. I see them very much paralleling I also do a lot of work in prison. Some of the
Sure.
schools that we've encountered, it feels very much like this is similar.
To a prison.
Yes, not from the
Interesting.
teachers, but from the
Yeah.
approachment of law enforcement, where it's like they're regulating what people are bringing into schools,
Sure.
what kind of, if you have drugs or contraband or things you shouldn't have at school, when you're, punished, like you get written up and there's like a hearing process. It's very much, doesn't seem like the kind of community resource officer that we would like to have in schools, but those do exist, but there's variation.
And are they hired through the local police service or no? And subconded to the schools, yeah?
Yeah, separate.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of the stakeholders that you're gonna be interviewing for qualitative interviews.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, are you considering interviewing like perpetrators of school violence and getting like, I just read narrative criminology, so I'm like, I think
Yes.
that'd be something really interesting to see.
I know, I would love to. We didn't get any kind of IRB approval to talk to any youth. And the data that we got from the Department of Juvenile Justice for outside of kind of linking purposes is de-identified. We just kind of want to protect the identities of these kids, but for a future project, I would love to get more into kind of why violence happens. I think it would be a lot more illuminating to the public. Yeah, but great question. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess kind of just touching on that why violence happens, like the root causes you discussed
Yeah.
at the onset of your
Yeah.
presentation. Can you speak more about how your work kind of translates to informing the root causes and then subsequently what can be done about school violence?
Yeah, I think in terms of the root causes, these do get after kind of like risk factors, and we're trying to understand kind of continuity and change of violence over time that can help us more identify from like a causal perspective, like why some of these things happen. But I think broadly what this project and the prior kind of syntheses of work has taught us is that it's not such a simple problem that can be solved from like a unitary policy, which seems to be kind of the rage, in particular in Florida, where they're like, let's just put a bunch of police officers in schools, or let's crack down and, let's have everyone wear clear backpacks and the problem of school violence is going to be solved, right? I think it really speaks to the fact when you think about that social ecological framework that there's really risk factors and protective factors at all of those ecological levels that need to be considered. And so the findings of the meta-analysis and some of these findings actually mirror evidence-based practices to address school climate in ways that also probably will reduce violence in schools as well. So there's like Safe Schools, Safe Communities, a program that really involves parents and local community members with discussions of what's going on in school. There's other kind of life skills training programs that have been implemented in schools that address kind of these multifaceted concepts. So in terms of root causes, there's not just one thing, but luckily there are evidence-based programs that do support addressing a lot of these issues. The problem is that they're difficult to implement because you have to involve a lot of different groups at once. And once they are implemented, sometimes it's hard to find the funding that's going to sustain them long term, especially with election cycles and things like that in school districts. But yeah. So I guess there's not one solution, but there are programs that do already address these factors, which is great.
Okay, I have Brian and then Kevin.
Hi, Ryan.
Good to see you.
You too.
So I'm going to channel my inner Joanne and
Okay.
ask a four-part question.
Okay, great.
So
Yeah.
I was really struck
Yeah.
at the beginning by the decline
Mm-hmm.
in school violence.
Yeah.
So leads me to think we must be doing something right.
Mm-hmm.
So what is working?
Mm-hmm.
Second, what's going on? Like,
Yeah.
is school violence moving elsewhere? Like
Yeah.
I'm thinking about cyberbullying and
Mhm.
things like that. And then, why are we putting so much money into
Yeah.
this issue? It's a huge issue,
Mm-hmm.
but why is there so much media, political attention being paid?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a three-part.
Yeah, that's not as bad as a Joanne question. No, that's great. So in terms of the decline in school violence, we actually see this decline for youth violence generally. And this is in the US, right? And so overall, we do see that violence has declined. And so the decline that's occurred in schools is not wholly unique from the decline in other contexts. But what I think I didn't emphasize, and what research also continually shows, is youth are less likely to be victimized at school than they are outside of school. So although there is this massive kind of national attention concern, kind of glorification of school violence, we see that youth are still more likely to be victimized in the community or in their homes if they're experiencing it at all. And so schools are actually safer places for youth than elsewhere, even though victimization and violence does happen there. I think with school shootings comes this concern that when youth are being sent to school, parents don't have control over them, and that's an environment where they should be safe and they're not. I think the media attention and the glorification of school violence has contributed to a lot of these concerns. There's been national surveys done basically asking parents, like, how often do you worry that your kid's going to be a victim of a school shooting? And a substantial portion say, I worry a lot about this. Even though it doesn't at all match up with the actual true statistical risks, it's a lot of the media and politics play a role in capitalizing on this issue. In Florida, we see this issue highly, highly politicized, not only with respect to we need to make, kind of crack down on violence in schools through school resource officers. There's also armed guardians that are in a lot of schools in Florida now, which are citizens who are armed, and they're meant to kind of take down a shooter when they happen. And they're meant to be not in that law enforcement role. So they're meant to be kind of, hi, I'm an everyday guy, but I just have a gun. So you know what I mean? So those are also in schools right now. I don't know, it's like a media frenzy, and but a lot of what legislative practices have put in place have not necessarily improved the school environment. So I don't know. I don't have the direct answer, but I think the media and political discourse has a lot to do with this concern, and maybe it's a distraction from violence in communities. Yeah.
Kevin and then Ashley.
Thanks for that. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess just following, this isn't what I was gonna ask, but just put a pin on it.
Yeah.
Put a pin in on it.
Mhm.
At one point, one of these armed guardians is gonna shoot up a school. That's gonna happen. But anyway, my comment is really just an invitation for you to sort of talk something about, you moved over very quickly, and that is the fact that the category violence is very fluid.
Yeah.
It's historically contingent.
Yes.
It's highly politicized.
Yes.
So I'm just curious how that might sort of play into this massive, intimidating project that you did, try a meta-analysis.
Yeah.
Do the findings look different if you disaggregate school shooting from like microaggressions?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so in the meta-analysis, so we broke out based on what we could do feasibly, analytically, in terms of like sample sizes. So we had kind of traditional violence, like physical violence, true assaults, versus bullying, kind of that kind of aggression, and then we had weapons-based violence. And there were no studies that could fit our meta-analytic criteria that actually looked at school shootings. And so what we found was, for the most part, all of our findings were general across categories of violence, with the exception of bringing a weapon to school. So we also looked at that as a separate outcome. So for youth who brought a weapon to school, we saw that things like victimization were a really strong predictor of other forms of violence, but for weapon carrying, not so much. And same with like peer rejection, not so much for weapon carrying. So some of those peer and social dynamics that seem to fuel a lot of the other violence or aggression that was happening at school didn't predict whether someone was going to bring a weapon to school or not. So our effects were actually more mixed for that. So I was like, do we need to do a separate meta-analysis just on bringing a weapon to school? But it seemed like there were other factors driving that we didn't have a good sense of in terms of our predictors. Yeah. Because it wasn't necessarily using a weapon for violence, it was simply carrying a weapon to school. Yeah. Yeah, good question though. Yeah.
Ashley and then Alex.
Oh, me, hi, sorry.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This is actually really related to this. So I was actually curious, a smaller question, but the category of violence with a weapon, so
Yeah.
from the study, the SRO study we did, it really depends on how the principal, the SRO, or a teacher, what they define as a weapon.
Yeah.
Because bringing a weapon to school is one thing, but it's very
Mhm.
categorically different from like violence with a weapon. So shooting
Yes.
a chair into a teacher
Mm-hmm.
can be qualified
Yeah.
or categorized as violence with a weapon. So I was curious how much raw data you actually had access to, because you also mentioned there was a bit of a gender difference, where
Yeah.
women were more likely, or sorry, like
Mhm.
girls in school, is the word looking for?
Yeah, yeah.
More likely to engage in violence with a weapon. And I was
Yeah.
curious, did you have access to what weapons were involved, what was categorized as a weapon, and then what kinds of weapons were girls using in comparison to men? Did you have access to
Oh,
that?
this is a really good question, because in the DJJ data, so in the referral data, it basically is like a firearm, a knife, like, or a blunt object, or then other, right? And so,
That's the chair.
that's the chair, that's like, you know, there's, you know, narratives, I don't have this narrative, but a school, you know, someone told me, it was like, someone threw a stapler at someone else's head, and like that counts as could count as weapons-based violence. And so, yeah, we are gonna use that broadly, so it may or may not actually include like a traditional weapon in that sense. It could be using an object to harm someone. So it's like a form of aggravated assault with something that could be considered a weapon, a blunt object, a knife or a gun,
I
or
think that's
other.
speaking to the problematization, like Kevin was mentioning.
It
like
is.
How we categorize violence or what
Yes.
a weapon is. And
Yes,
sorry, did you have any like data differentiation between like girls and boys in their use of
I
different
can
types
look
of
at that, we
weapons?
haven't even looked at that yet, but that's a really good question. I'll have to look into it more. Because we have the ability to look a little bit more with respect to the kinds of weapons that were being used. Yeah, you're welcome. But yeah, girls are still at like, again, just like 10% of those referrals involve women, but still, or girls, yeah.
Alex.
Yeah.
So I was curious, when you're
Yeah.
thinking about when it seems like schools are a safer place for kids than community. So especially just given how politicized like this entire problem
Mhm.
is, and when you're thinking about the future and where you want to make your impacts in policy, how are you planning with like sometimes with programming
Yeah.
to make sure we're not pushing kids out of a space that's safer
Exactly.
into communities that might not be
Mhm.
the best place for them to go? How are you making sure that that's not the direction that you're?
I know, I'm hoping to, and I think that goes back to using some of this as not ways to further kind of like monitor and surveil youth who we would be considered like at risk. I think there can be considered kind of forms of, you know, markers for vulnerability or support rather than problematization or threat. And so in the messaging, like when I work with the Office of Safe Schools, who are in charge of administering all the threat assessment trainings to the state of Florida, we really try and emphasize that. And emphasize too that especially for youth with a lot of those kind of home life trauma risk factors, they're less likely if they're engaging in violence to be doing so at school. And so to the extent that school is a safe haven for them, we don't want to further marginalize them from the school environment. But it really involves kind of clear messaging with our stakeholders to make sure that these findings are not used as, again, another way to kind of treat youth as threatening or in need of surveillance.
And then for
Yeah.
stakeholders, does this include, so like you have your SROs, teachers, does it include like the armed citizens too?
Oh, the armed
Or whatever they're called, I can't get over that.
The armed guardians?
Armed guardians, sorry.
Yeah, it mostly involves, for us, in terms of communicating our findings at a broader level, where we have, you know, for anyone who's participated in the interviews, we're gonna share with them the findings, but most of our messaging is disseminated to people at the school district level. So who are in charge of really determining what policies are gonna be implemented within the schools, rather than those on the ground who don't have a lot of say over how they're putting things into practice, or they, you know what I mean, like actually putting in a new program. And then at the Department of Education level, in terms of their training and threat assessment teams, we're in a lot of communication with them, and juvenile justice officers. So when youth are referred to the juvenile justice system, the Department of Juvenile Justice is involved a lot in our work to make sure that they're not treating kids who have like risk markers in terms of their assessments as really truly dangerous for the school setting. They're trying to keep kids out of the school or prison pipeline more now than in years past. If that helps, but it's a challenge, yeah.
So, given Florida's approach to this issue seems to be atypical, are the results in Florida atypical? Like, are they getting different results?
Atypical in terms of relative to Canada, maybe not relative to the American South,
Okay.
right? And so in terms of their atypical findings, I mean, I think we hear similar things from other states when I talk to researchers or people who are involved in implementing trainings and life skills trainings at CU. That's the life skills training program is housed there. They have similar challenges in that oftentimes there's practices that are implemented at a state or legislative level, saying like, we're gonna put resource officers in schools. And the people on the ground may not necessarily want that, but they have to do it anyway. And so we have people who are really invested in kind of holistic programming for schools, and then they have to kind of compete with or modify what they're doing to combat, okay, all of the target hardening that's happening to the school setting, implementing clear backpacks, doing lockdown drills, and having more armed personnel in schools when they're really just trying to do their holistic programming. So how those things can coexist together and the extent to which these kinds of punitive policies may counteract or affect the good things that schools are doing, that's something that we really want to try and explore through some of our qualitative interviews in Florida, because there's a ton of variation, right? There's a lot of, at the school level, at the district level, they don't really want necessarily what the governor may want for their school or their environment, but they have to contend with it anyway. So I didn't really answer your question, but that's the context. Yeah. Yeah.
You have the last question.
Okay, I don't even really have a question. As much as it is a
go.
discussion
Yeah.
point. When you mentioned that Florida is very similar to a lot of the American South, I can validate that in a way. I'm from Georgia.
Yes.
I got my undergrad from good old Reinhardt University in the backwoods of Georgia.
Yeah.
With a focus in criminal justice, and it is very similar. I wasn't super surprised. I'm not trying to portray myself as an expert or anything, but a lot of the trends that you noted, like the overall downward trend in
Yeah.
crime, but also those crimes being more violent in particular demographics, the causative factors, it was very interesting to see. And I almost wonder how much of the politicization of school shootings could be attributed to like kind of a Trojan horse for other programs.
For sure.
You know, using it to, I mean, this was way back my freshman year of college, that we discussed how statistics are used by individual police departments to increase their budgeting and paint a narrative like, oh, we need more support in this way, or we need more money in this direction, and you know, similar programs like with various boards of educations, increasing the surveillance of books, of different school materials. I don't know. I don't think that's a question, but maybe there's something better to speak to than
No, I mean, I think your point about how kind of the political attention in the school setting allows people in power to have more control over the school environment or justify controlling the school environment in ways that perhaps they wouldn't before. We see this in the South right now, but yeah. I'm glad it reflects kind of a reality. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
In some way, yeah.
Okay, so then please thank Dr. Kiwami. All have lunch, but I will ask you to stay seated for 1 second because we do need a photo, right, for the newsletter, which I
Good
always
idea.
forget. So I will do that unless